Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. I finished reading this book today. It's a book of literary criticism about Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, a book which I finished reading earlier in the month. It's long been my practice to supplement the reading of a book that I like, a great work, with literary criticism as I can find it. Norton critical editions are good for that purpose. I would suppose there does exist one about War and Peace, but it must be a monster of a volume. Those books will reprint the text followed by supplemental material. So nowadays it seems like you can only find literary criticism if it bears the name Harold Bloom on it for some reason. I don't particularly like Harold Bloom, but his compilations of criticism are generally pretty good, and this one was good. I liked most of the essays but one. Tolstoy famously appended a couple of epilogues to his great novel, and one of the essays dealt solely with those epilogues. I did not like the epilogues very much, and I did not like the criticism about them. Otherwise, I enjoyed the book. I least enjoy the type of criticism where the writer has a thesis and then is trying to pin the work to that thesis. And this book is not free of that. The final essay by Martin Price really struck me as the best of the lot, and I would just like to give you a paragraph from that. I don't think it's going to spoil your reading of the novel. It pertains to the famous general, the one-eyed general Kutuzov. And let me just show you how Martin Price characterizes him. We see Kutuzov, then, improvising a series of tactical retreats, allowing the French forces to occupy Moscow, watching them founder in their ill-conceived retreat. He does not play the game of dazzling strategy and glorious victory. Only he, in fact, knows that the Battle of Borodino was a victory for the Russians and the turning point in Napoleon's expedition. Kutuzov has his own game, if that is the word for it. He is like the patient defendant who keeps prudently deferring a trial until the plaintiff litigates himself into insolvency. For his game is not winning a lawsuit, but defeating the plaintiff. And sapping the plaintiff's will or his fortune is less costly and risky than confronting him in court. This is perhaps an unattractive account of Kutuzov's method, but one must think of him as a defendant who believes so completely in the justness of his cause that he does not need to declare it or defend it in a court. It's a very succinct way of summarizing how this general approached the war in Tolstoy's view. And that is the kind of thing that I look to good criticism for. You don't always find things as pristine as that, alas. Throughout the course of reading this, however, I have begun to have doubts. I've talked about how I used to primarily be a writer and then a writer of poetry and plays. I have given up that habit, and for the last 2 years now devoted myself to trying to become a reader. It's hard to be a reader when one is a writer, I think. And so now that I have let go of the one, I want to take up the other. And I find as I remove myself further and further from the field of authordom or authorship, that the idea of criticism interests me less and less. Last year I read the Iliad for the first time, and I got a book of criticism on that, not done by Harold Bloom, oddly enough, some chap surnamed Ford, but I can't remember the first. And it was interesting. I like revisiting a text in that way, but also it did not stir me. And so it may be that I am just in a different phase of my life now. Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads recently did the Memento Mori tag, which is going around, and he said as far as predicting the future, one cannot tell where his interests will lie. And I have never really had any kind of a fluctuation in my interests because I have not read all that substantially throughout the course of my life, excepting the last 2 years. Last year I started reading natural history, and I find my interests moving in that direction, and also possibly away from literary criticism. Now I may try to do a little bit more reading of literary criticism before I decide to chuck all of my books. I recently picked up Randall Jarrell, a famous American poet, and I know some of his poems. I've never read his criticism, but he has a great reputation. So I may decide to tackle that sometime soon. I expect to be reading Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain as my next novel, and I will look forward to augmenting that with this. Shelley Fisher Fishkin edited the one of the editions of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn that I own, and wrote a very interesting introduction. And so I would like to see this. I remember this talked about when it came out, and the premise sounds very interesting to me. So I will follow that up. But after that, I don't know for sure. I brought out some Edmund Wilson just to show in case I needed it. But he was one of the critics that really meant a lot to me. His work is out in a Library of America 2-volume set, and I have that. I've read just about everything he did, except for some of the, I forget what he called them, commercials and constipations or something like that. This set of sort of, I think, literary gossip sort of books. I can't remember anymore. It's been decades, believe me. And oddly enough, I find, I've been reading Ancient Iraq, and I find that discussion about the ancient gods, or as we would call them, myths, to have begun interesting me, and I've never had a tolerance for reading about myths. I've never been able to stand that stuff. So it may signal a change in my direction. I even wonder if history itself may be threatened. I've mentioned that early on I discovered a book by Moses Finley, or M.I. Finley, Ancient History, Evidence and Models, because I wanted to understand how we know history. How do we know what we know? How do we know that it's right? And his book was a good place to start. And through that, I had my entry into ancient civilizations. Now, reading about the Sumerians, I'm beginning to think that for a person nowadays, the best entry point would not necessarily be Greece or Rome if you are just beginning to study about antiquity, but would more likely be something such as the Sumerians. I think when I was first making my tentative gropings in that direction, Finley and the Greeks were exactly right. And I stayed stuck in that period and that place for a long time, even before I moved on to a little bit of dabbling with the Romans. And now I'm just more interested in everything as far as history, but I could easily foresee a time coming when I decide to leave history go. And I would like to just read a little bit from this book by Moses Finley. It is a collection of essays, a really marvelous group of essays. And I will read from the very first essay in the book titled Myth, Memory, and History. The fathers of history were Greeks. Historians of antiquity are very proud of that, so much so that they prefer not to remember that some of the best minds in antiquity were not all impressed by this achievement. History as a discipline has always been a great favorite with the coiners of bon mots. It is false, it is dangerous, it is bunk. Historians can comfortably ignore the jibes and doubts of Walpole or Henry Ford or even Goethe, but Aristotle is another matter. Aristotle, after all, founded a number of sciences and made all the others his own too, in one fashion or another, except history and economics. He did not jibe at history, he rejected it in the famous dictum in the 9th chapter of his Poetics. Quote, "Poetry is more philosophical and more weighty than history, for poetry speaks rather of the universal, history of the particular. By the universal, I mean that such or such a kind of man will say or do such or such things from probability or necessity. That is the aim of poetry, adding proper names to the characters. By the particular, I mean what Alcibiades did and what he suffered." It's kind of odd that history, which probably I turned to largely to augment my poetry, might be something additional to literary criticism that I could see dropping away. I don't think I'm at that stage yet, but this essay, I couldn't remember exactly where it was, but this essay closes with an interesting comparison between Thucydides and Tolstoy, which has been in my mind, and I didn't remember that it was in this particular essay. Now, Finley quotes a little bit from the Isaiah Berlin essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox, I believe it's called. All of the essays, I'm exaggerating when I say all, but a lot of them make mention of that essay, a famous piece of Tolstoy criticism. And I made a conscious choice. I have it in a book of essays by Berlin. I made a conscious choice after glancing at it not to read it, at least not at this time. I like the shorter pieces in here. And just let me, this comes toward the end of Finley's essay, and let me read you what he has to say. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit more than perhaps you strictly speaking would need. In a brilliantly phrased paragraph, Collingwood said, "The Greek historian cannot, like Gibbon, begin by wishing to write a great historical work and go on to ask himself what he shall write about. Instead of the historian choosing the subject chooses the historian. I mean that history is written only because memorable things have happened which call for a chronicler among the contemporaries of the people who have seen them. One might almost say that in ancient Greece, there were no historians in the sense in which there were artists and philosophers. There were no people who devoted their lives to the study of history. The historian was only the autobiographer of his generation, and autobiography is not a profession, unquote. This may be too simple, too one-sided. It is not simply false. Thucydides found himself caught up in contradictory pulls, which he was never able to resolve. He accepted the need to narrate events in sequence, but on the other hand, he wished to extract from the events the essence of politics and political behavior, the nature and consequences of power. That, if he could achieve it, would be a possession forever, among other reasons because human nature is a constant and therefore recurrence is the pattern. But if so, what is the point to a linear account over long periods of time? One can really know only one's own time, and that is sufficient anyway. The past can yield nothing more than paradigmatic support for the conclusions one has drawn from the present. The past, in other words, may still be treated in the timeless fashion of myth. There is a relevant passage in Sir Isaiah Berlin's The Hedgehog and the Fox, which is about Tolstoy, but in which one could substitute the name of Thucydides and go a long way, though not the whole way, without sacrificing accuracy. And then here's the quote from Berlin. Tolstoy's interest in history began early in his life. It seems to have arisen not from interest in the past as such, but from the desire to penetrate to first causes, to understand how and why things happen as they do and not otherwise, from a tendency to doubt and place under suspicion and, if need be, reject whatever does not fully answer the question, to go to the root of every matter at whatever cost. And with this went an incurable love of the concrete, the empirical, the verifiable, and an instinctive distrust of the abstract, the impalpable, the supernatural. In short, an early tendency to a scientific and positivist approach, unfriendly to romanticism, abstract formulations, metaphysics. Always and in every situation, he looked for hard facts. He was tormented by the ultimate problems which face young men in every generation, but the answers provided by theologians and metaphysicians struck him as absurd. History, only the sum of the concrete events in time and space. This alone contained the truth, the material out of which genuine answers might be constructed. Then Finlay continues, so one wrote War and Peace, the other the Peloponnesian War. I am not being frivolous when I put it that way. History contained the truth, and for Thucydides, that meant that it was unnecessary to invent as the poets did. But it was also impossible merely to record what had happened. It was necessary to compose speeches which would lay bare the appropriate arguments, appropriate in Thucydides' judgment, on both sides of an issue. It was even necessary to write a sophistical treatise on might and right, the Melian dialogue. The narrative alone proved a failure in the end. It told only what Alcibiades did and what he suffered. Those were facts, not truths. So that is the place where I find myself having arrived to recently. Concurrently, as a year-long project, I have been reading The History of the United States by Henry Adams, and at the point where I am at early in the term of Thomas Jefferson, a lot pertaining to Napoleon has been dredged up. Of course, the whole Louisiana Purchase is occurring at that time and setting the government of the U.S. into a kind of crisis. But I find that perhaps, as Aristotle had said, just knowing what Napoleon did or said in itself does not interest me that much. However, as Napoleon appears in Tolstoy, that was wonderful. That was a different matter. And Tolstoy's work, the novel itself, that to me was the epic, akin to Homer, if you will, akin to the Iliad, and all of the other stuff, the epilogues, the philosophy that was embedded in the text of Tolstoy I liked, but the epilogues, which were more or less standalone, I didn't care for. And so maybe I am just moving away from these abstract social sciences, if you will. Anyhow, these are just thoughts. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.